So we're delighted to have with us Jane Muncke today. She is the managing director of the Food Packaging Forum and one of the leading experts on the topic of food packaging. If you want to know more about food packaging than you ever wanted to know, I strongly encourage you to go to the webpage because they have a bunch of really brilliant videos where Jane and some of her associates talk about the role of different aspects in food packaging. And we'll talk about some of those here as well. But again, I strongly encourage you to go to their page here. And Jane thankfully just posted that her webpage to the chat. So thanks, Jane, for that. But before we go, maybe, Jane, a few words on yourself and the role the Food Packaging Forum has within the larger food industry.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So, my background is in environmental science. I studied at ETH Zurich. I specialized in environmental chemistry, and then I did a PhD, a doctoral degree in environmental toxicology, also at ETH Zurich. For the last 14 years, I've been working on chemicals in food packaging, how they transfer, or we call it migrate, into food, what the impacts on human health are, and also what the environmental impacts are of these chemicals in food packaging, but also the other aspects of food packaging impacting on the environment. 9 years ago, I was tasked with setting up the Food Packaging Forum, which is a charitable foundation. The founder of Food Packaging Forum is Bucher Emhard Glass, a big Swiss company that you probably know. I was tasked by Bucher to set up the Food Packaging Forum, and I've been running it ever since. What we do at Food Packaging Forum is we make knowledge available. And we do that in many different ways. Our target audience are usually professional stakeholders. So people who work on food packaging from a professional perspective, be it in academia, be it in the media, be it in civil society, be it in all different types of industry, and also with regulators. But we don't do advocacy. So we're not a campaigning NGO that we go out there and say, you have to change this and that, get rid of plastic and so on. That's not what we try to do. We try to provide as objectively and as balanced as possible the facts about all the different types of food packaging and their impacts on human health and the environment, with a focus on the chemicals.
Okay, perfect. Brilliant introduction, thanks. And Jane, myself, we had a rather prolonged back and forth in preparing this call and discussing the topics, and we kind of shifted back and forth. So just the preparatory work was really interesting just for that. But I mean, let's start with the basics. And again, I mean, we're talking about non-carbonated soft drinks and mainly liquid dairy, so not a lot of the other food areas you're covering. But again, I mean, I think one of the discussions we had is what is the role of packaging for the company's identity, but also for the strategy, right? And this was something you said, well, I mean, we'll talk about the up scorecard and so forth, but what you said, well, we really need to think about what is the company's strategy and how does packaging kind of support that. So maybe let's start with sort of more the top-down view, the high-level helicopter view here.
Yeah, so I think one of the trends over the last few years has been the strong focus on plastic pollution. And plastic pollution is, of course, an end-of-life phenomenon for a lot of packaging, right? And so people, when they think about food packaging, oftentimes think about the end of life of food packaging, and now sort of your big brand owners, FMCGs, and so on are coming under a lot of pressure from the consumer who doesn't want plastic pollution, and so they're demanding from brands get rid of all plastic. The problem with that focus is that you're looking end of pipe. And it's very, very, very difficult to find good solutions that are robust over a long time if you just look end of pipe. So if you just focus on the end of life. Why? Because there's a reason why single-use packaging is very popular with brands for very simple reason of being economically more feasible, right? So it's a whole business model that is enabled by single-use cheap food packaging, and most of that is plastic, but I know that you're very interested also in the beverage cartons right now, and they use a lot of plastic as well, basically. So when I say plastic, I also do mean the beverage cartons, just to be clear. So the whole business model only works if you have this availability at this price of the cheap single-use food packaging. The challenge with the end of life, just to cover that as well real quickly, is that plastic cannot be recycled, really, because of its material properties. So you can, if you have very simple plastic, like these PET bottles, for example, that are very common for non-carbonated soft drinks, you can maybe 3-4 times you can recycle that, but with each recycling step, you're degrading the material properties. And that becomes uneconomical after a while to have plastics that don't have the perfect material properties. Also, at the same time, you have virgin material that is cheaper than recycled material. So there's not really a strong incentive other than consumers demanding that brands have to do something about plastic pollution. So that kind of just shows you that this is actually a really, really complicated topic. It's not just, okay, packaging, plastic, people don't like it, let's switch to something else. Because when you do switch to something else, then the question automatically is, well, what's the alternative? And you can look at this from different angles. Of course, economically, you don't want something that is a lot more expensive. But the point also is food packaging has a function, right? It preserves your food. That's kind of the original and core function, food preservation. But then you have to think about how brands use food packaging, how they produce the foods. It's very, very globalized. You have centralized, we call them filling lines, right? Where you fill your product into the packaging, and you produce your product in one location for the entire global market. So you need to have food packaging that will work in your supply chain, that will work with your logistics, and at the same time also isn't economically more burdensome. And so it really is the functionality of food packaging, I think, that needs to be one of the key focuses. And then when you think about the functionality of food packaging, it's very quickly that you start thinking about, okay, what actually is my business model? What am I actually selling here? And sometimes you have to think out of the box a little bit, because you're not selling packaged drinks. You're selling a refreshment, or something like that. You're business people, you know that better than I do. But then maybe you can come up with a completely new way of delivery, of getting people the product that you're selling, but with a completely different delivery and different food packaging requirements then. I don't know if that makes sense, Flo. It's difficult to see it.
I think you're coming at it from kind of two, so the way I understand it is you're coming at it from two perspectives. So on the one hand side, if I think about the sustainability of packaging in sort of a life cycle analysis, and we talked about that in a prior discussion here, in a prior fireside chat, then what we find is that basically all single-use options are kind of bad. The question is just which is least bad type of discussion. But what we really want is a way more reusable type of situation where this is the only way we can really make, you know, significant sustainability headwinds, right? But the problem with that is obviously that creates all sorts of other economic burdens and requires a lot of, I think, industry collaboration, right? I think the discussion about recyclability rates is very intimately connected with the question of Pfandsysteme, whatever the English term for that is.
Deposit schemes.
Deposit schemes, exactly, right? So, I mean, in most jurisdictions, you need a deposit scheme to really get reusability rates up into the 90 percentage points or so. And your point is that is the problem. What we really need to think about is how can we sort of create different value propositions which kind of work around some of these constraints. Is that what you're saying? Because you play, it's, I guess so. But maybe to make it more concrete, do you have a good example of that? Who would you think is a good example within the industry? And maybe it's not even liquid dairy, maybe it's something else where you think they have really rethought the whole packaging and created a different value proposition for the consumer.
Well, I mean, in the dairy industry, you know, the milkman comes to mind. That I know that's not, it doesn't exist anymore, but for a long time, and maybe some people are too young to know what the milkman was. But in the UK, in the United Kingdom, someone dropped off 1 to how many bottles of milk you wanted every morning on your doorstep, in a returnable deposit glass bottle. And so you'd put out the empty bottles and they would pick those up when they delivered the filled bottles. I don't know why that became unpopular. Probably it didn't work economically. That's probably the reason. But that would kind of be one of those ideas, you know. You bind customers to your brand, you deliver it at their doorstep. I mean, you can't have more convenience. It's in a way also more environmentally friendly, because instead of everyone going individually to the shop to get their product, you've got, you know, one truck or whatever it is driving around dropping off the product. That would be one example. So I think that the attractiveness of these deposit scheme business models is really also that you kind of bind your customers, you have loyalty. The container has a value. It really has an economic value because you have a deposit on it. There's another example here. For those who live in Zurich may know the restaurant chain Lily's. Lily's Stomach Supply, it's Asian food. And they have a home delivery, and you pay 10 francs as a deposit for stainless steel tiffin. And the next time you order home delivery from Lily's, you just kind of mark how many of those tiffins you want to return, and then they deduce it from your bill. Or you keep them if you want to use them at home. So those are kind of examples for this. Maybe the third example that I will take, Flo, you and I, we both grew up in Germany, so you also are familiar with this Deutscher Brunnen. Basically, it's a coalition of fillers who fill non-carbonated soft drinks into deposit glass bottles, and they're all small businesses, but they together set up a bottle deposit scheme. So they all have the same shape of bottle, which makes sense economically. And they differentiate by putting on different labels. And you can, anywhere in Germany, you can return these bottles to the supermarket. So that could be another example.
Yeah. If you go through Jane's internet page, you'll figure out, and also if you look at the UP scorecard, you'll figure out she's a great fan of stainless steel reusable containers, and we might get to that. But just on the deposit scheme, because it's it's an interesting, I mean, I think we've had in the industry very few examples, and you just mentioned one, of sort of industry-driven voluntary deposit schemes versus regulatory mandated deposit schemes. So how do you see that? Do you see there's an increasing pressure by the regulator? I mean, you talk a lot to the regulators. Are we seeing a lot of those schemes coming down the pipe? Or, you know, is it where we are right now? You know, will there be any change?
Well, I think one of the big barriers for deposit schemes is you've got to store the stuff. So it becomes a logistical challenge, right? If you've ever been to one of these specialized places, Getränkemarkt, where they just sell drinks and it's all deposit, they have huge areas where they just store the empty crates of bottles in order for them to get shipped back to the fillers. So I think I'm not an economist, right? But I assume that there is an economic barrier there, which makes it less attractive. So of course, you know, if you have single use, then end of life is not the producer's responsibility in that sense anymore, right? They don't have to worry about it. The supermarkets don't have to worry about it. If you have deposit schemes, you need places where people return the containers. The supermarkets, they need storage space, which costs money. They don't want to do it. So I think in order to, but I do very strongly believe that going back to this type of deposit scheme is the future. And there are a couple of companies who've got interesting solutions. I just want to mention Tomra. They make these reverse vending machines. It's super high tech. I mean, it's very clean. There's a couple of supermarkets in southern Germany that I go to every now and then when I visit my relatives there. And you just take your containers, you stick it into this hole in the wall, literally, and then there's a little conveyor belt, and the barcode is scanned, and you then get basically your money back. So it's neat, clean, convenient as much as it can be for the consumer. I have my doubts that there's going to be a sort of voluntary shift by supermarkets, retailers, and brand owners to go to the deposit scheme, because it's economically, unfortunately, right now not a very attractive proposition. So I do think, yes, we need the regulator to get behind this. And I also think it would make sense, you know, to have a sort of regulatory countrywide scheme, deposit scheme, which is subsidized, at least for now, to make the transition. But yeah, to answer your question, I think I don't see that trend yet. As people are still talking about recycling, and people are still trying to kind of make recycling work, which I have my serious doubts about it for several reasons.
Yeah, so Tomra, great company. I'm actually meeting them about, you know, every year, twice a year or so. But interesting, even if you talk to them, even they say, you know, we only start selling our machines if a deposit scheme is introduced into a single country, right? And so they also say the voluntary movement is very difficult. I think before we get into some of the discussions of the what is the least bad solution, and to sort of get us a little closer to our topic at hand, but I mean, I think the other issue is, so we got two key drivers. One is obviously the regulator, which can mandate change, but the other one is consumer perception. And I think this is where you started out with in your topic, right? So, so how quickly is consumer perception changing on the issue of, you know, single-use plastic? I know it's not the core of what you guys are doing, but still, do you have a perception there? Is that already a key component of, you know, within the discussions you have with corporate?
So I think consumer perception has been a huge factor in the last, I would say, 6 years. So I started working on this topic, specifically food packaging, 14 years ago. And at the time, not many people were interested in this. And so over the last 14 years, I have seen a huge change in consumer perception. Again, because of this focus on plastic pollution, right? And what could be stronger than these visuals that we've been seeing of seabirds with, dying from ingesting plastic, fish, stomachs cut open full of plastic. It may seem a little bit alarmist to people, but it is a reality. Plastic doesn't go away in the environment, and we're not managing the plastic terribly well. A lot of the so-called recycled plastic from the first world gets shipped to the global south, Ghana, Indonesia, and so on, oftentimes illegally. And there it just gets spilled into the environment. People burn it, wild burning, which causes all kinds of toxic problems. It gets into the oceans, and then it doesn't go away. So I think that whole issue has really accelerated a lot in terms of awareness. At the same time, I think people are also starting to think a bit more about, or a lot more about climate. We know that, right? We've got the COP right now going on, COP26. Plastics are made from fossil carbon. And a lot of the plastic that doesn't get littered gets burnt then. At least in Switzerland, all of our plastic waste is, or most of our plastic waste is burned. Very, very little is recycled. So essentially we're taking fossil carbon, making something that we use for a short time out of it, and then we're incinerating it and putting fossil carbon into the atmosphere. I think that's also a fact that a lot of people are starting to understand, this link between plastic packaging in particular and climate change, and putting the fossil carbon that needs to stay in the ground into the air is not a good idea, just to be clear about that. I think a third aspect that I want to highlight here is what I've been working on for all of my career, namely chemicals, and how chemicals impact environmental systems, but also human health. And I think that's a very complicated topic. And even when I say chemicals, I see how people's eyes start to gloss over and they're bored immediately. But I mean, chemicals are front and center of everything that we are. They're part of life. And if we disrupt life by introducing synthetic man-made chemicals that are persistent and toxic, we are really setting us off on a bad track. And we're starting to see some effects of that. For example, declining sperm counts, or other forms of infertility, young people who want to have children not being able to conceive, people in their 30s and 40s getting cancer, people in their 30s and 40s, I keep saying that age, not old people, that's what I'm stressing here, younger people getting all kinds of chronic diseases, neurological disorders in kids, allergies, and so on and so forth. I'm not saying that all of this is because of plastic, okay, just to be clear. These are very complex diseases. Oftentimes we don't actually understand the etiology of these diseases, but we do know that some of the chemicals that we use in plastic that get out of plastic into food, for example, have been implicated with causing these diseases in animal experiments. And we also see some really good epidemiology coming out now, showing that people who are exposed to low levels of these chemicals throughout their life have adverse effects. And so I think that is sort of the third pillar here that I want to stress. So that the plastic pollution, environmental impacts, climate change in particular, and hazardous chemicals.
Thanks, Jane. I thought this relation between reusability and recycling rates and the CO2 emissions over the life cycle is a really helpful thought here. I think we're in the midst of sort of, and we need to shift tack a little bit and talk about the least bad alternatives if we sort of stay within the mainly single-use options that we have, right? And I think you said you started just now listing out some of the criteria you guys are looking at. One is sort of, what is sort of life cycle carbon emissions, I guess is one of those, the reusability, then obviously plastic waste in general, how's it being, what's the end of the life, how does it end, and then chemical migration, obviously options. What other options, what other sort of criteria do you use to think about food packaging, beyond those three?
So I think another important criterion is the sourcing, and that becomes really important when we talk about alternatives to fossil carbon-based plastic. There's sort of been, also now for 15 years or so, they've sort of been these so-called bioplastics that have gradually crept onto the market. Bio, because on the one hand, they are made from renewable carbon sources, so agricultural products, but also on the other hand, because they can degrade in the environment. So I think if we look at that, I do think using renewable carbon is better than using fossil carbon. I think that's clear. That's a blanket statement I stand by. But of course, you also have to look carefully how much fossil carbon is used to produce your renewable carbon, if you know what I mean. Because if you're making agricultural products, you've got tractors driving along, and you've got fertilizer, which is made also with a lot of fossil carbon input, Haber-Bosch process, and so on. And so you've got like a lot of hidden fossil carbon behind those products. And that's oftentimes not part of the discussion, right? So be careful there. The same goes for paper, by the way. Paper also requires input, agricultural inputs to produce the wood that is made. And it's oftentimes also not very environmentally friendly, the way that the wood is produced. So I think it just shows how complicated it all is, right? But the sourcing is definitely important. Another aspect is maybe not so intuitive in a country like Switzerland, but fresh water is a scarce resource. And if you produce, renewable carbon using non-renewable aquifers, for example, that's not a sustainable approach. So I think that's also really important, the fresh water use. And then, the six on my list here, I know where you're going, Flo. You're looking at the Understanding Packaging Scorecard, which is a tool that we recently published for scoring packaging in terms of environmental and human health impacts. So the sixth metric here is the chemicals of concern. So what are the chemicals that you use to make your food packaging? Are they hazardous? Have they never been tested at all? Because that unfortunately also can be the case, that there's no information on the hazard properties and so on. So those are the things that I would highlight here.
Thanks, Jade. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think what is brilliant is, which is the challenge for us on our side, is the more we talk to you, the more we understand how complicated this is, right? Yeah. This isn't easy. There are a lot of confounding factors. You kind of have to look on a case-by-case basis in the end, it seems like. But you did the great effort and tried to dumb it down for people like us with the up scorecard, right? And Jane just and posted that. So, with the caveat that it's a tremendous simplification of the work you are doing, can you talk us through what the thought process was for you to develop that, and what, I think we've talked about the 6 criteria, but how should we think about sort of the results of the scorecard that come out? Obviously, stainless steel is the best, right? But that's a given, right?
Hey, I feel I need to defend myself here.
No, clearly.
Well, so the story of Understanding Packaging Scorecard is quite simple. We were approached by Google, believe it or not. Google is, well, you know this better than I, they're the biggest company in the world in terms of revenue, one of the big ones. And I think they pay very careful attention to the image that they have also for their employees. So they want to be attractive for people to go and work there. And this is all hypothesis. I don't know if this is really true, but I'm thinking that this was their motivation. They have these fantastic cafeterias and canteens and so on, try to be a great employer to attract the best talent. And people were complaining that there was too much plastic waste in their cafeterias, employers who were concerned about the environmental impact. And so Google funded an accelerator program that brought together a whole bunch of different stakeholders, including their cafeteria providers, right? The food service providers. Again, some of the biggest ones, SV Service in Switzerland is part of this group, Compass Group, Sodexo, Vendra, Subway, and NGOs and experts on food packaging and environmental and human health impacts. And together we then came up with this tool, this tool is necessary. The target audience for this tool is primarily the procurement officers for the food service providers. And so the idea is that someone working at SV Service can use this tool when they're placing a new order for their cafeterias. And they have huge purchasing power, obviously. So that's kind of our theory of change behind this, that if Google kind of introduces this as a policy that all their food service providers use this tool, then we may be able to shift something in the marketplace. That's kind of the idea behind this. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. No, I think it's really interesting because, I mean, when we think about sort of who decides on the packaging format, right? We kind of think it's the food manufacturer. But I think what we hear over and over again, it's not really the food manufacturer. They're being dictated by the food service companies, by the retailers, the type of packaging they need to provide, right? And then they go out and say, okay, this is what we got. So it's interesting who's really driving decisions within this whole value chain here, yes. Right?
I cannot stress that more, Flo. I think that is an absolute critical point here. It's the retailers. I mean, now we talk about food service providers. I don't have the numbers in my head, but I would hazard a guess that the retailers have probably the vast majority of sales, food sales. And that's also why and especially with COVID, right? When everyone was at home cooking for themselves. Yeah. They're the gatekeepers here.
Okay, I mean, if when I played around with the scorecard, particularly on the beverage carton, right? I think you have the beverage carton and the cups. I think are the areas which are currently freely available. I think, yeah. Right?
2 or 3 weeks we'll have everything available. Just as a quick.
Okay, brilliant. Looking forward to that. But I mean, a beverage carton is what we talk about anyways, right? So there are 2 things which I thought was interesting when I played around with. One is the bioplastic. I mean, it really didn't really matter much if I use plastics or bioplastics on your scorecard. They kind of score equally bad. To matters of degree, but I mean, equally bad. And then secondly, it was clear that obviously reusable options like stainless steel or glass are obviously the best, but then actually I thought glass and then carton obviously were much better than the plastic alternatives. And so my second question from this long-winded blah blah is do you think that's the direction of travel for the industry? Are we going to see more? Are we going to move back to glass, which because that has been not really been used a lot lately?
Well, I mean, glass has a very clear disadvantage, and then we come back to the retailers as gatekeepers. People, when they drop glass in the aisles in the supermarket, make a huge mess. And I think that's one of the key barriers why glass hasn't been on the shelves a lot, because the retailers don't want it. But to be honest, I think, I mean, the direction that we should be headed in, I'm not going to say where we are going because I simply don't know. And it's always dangerous to make predictions, but where we should be going is consuming less overall. And we should not have this craziness of shipping products long distance. That's just not, it's not environmentally sustainable. And I mean, what we're seeing right now with supply chains across the world kind of imploding, I don't know if that's the right word, but being a huge challenge, I think it would also be a smart business decision to get away from this super lean and, you know, optimizing just on one aspect and kind of strengthening your business by having more local suppliers. And then, of course, glass could become a more attractive proposition because, of course, the weight of glass works against long distance transport. Yeah. But it's anyone's guess where we're going. As I said repeatedly, my preference is, first of all, less consumption. That's really where we need to go. At least in our part of the world, we are over consuming. We need to get really cut down on consumption quite a lot. And then prefer local produce, seasonal, regional, less processed, and then ideally, of course, in deposit containers.
Yeah, so I'm not going to wade into the degrowth discussion. We can have that over a beer or a cocktail at some point. But on I think the value, the supply chain discussion is interesting because, as you said, it's not only more sustainable, but I think we've seen that they tend to be more resilient as well, right? They're more diversified and thereby more resilient. And this is what is driving a lot of the issues that we're having right now. And we actually had that before, right? So I mean, we've had a few instances where we had similar instances, but just focus on single industry. That's why they weren't that well known. But can you talk about that in terms of how, do we have the capabilities to, or how quickly can we build these more decentralized production facilities? Because currently we're very much, we have one huge filling station and we have one provider of all the pets. And so, I mean, how big a change in the economic ecosystem would be required to go there?
A huge change. And first and foremost, starting with consumers. I've been worried about the development of the world for a long time already. So a couple of years ago, I already joined a community-supported agriculture project. And you probably don't know this, so let me just explain quickly what it is. So it's a group of people who put money together, their own private money, and hire a farmer. And basically, together with that farmer, produce food and pay the farmer a fixed salary independent of if it's a good year or a bad year, because that happens in agriculture. And then if it's a good year, everyone enjoys a good harvest. And if it's a bad year, we support each other. So there's a couple of these projects coming up now. So I live in Zurich. One of them is Dunkelhölzli. There's Orto Loco. There's a whole bunch of these. There's some for dairy product. There's some for meat. And I think that is definitely a trend. But of course, it means that I'm not a consumer anymore, or just a consumer anymore. I'm part of this group of people, and I have responsibility. I go and work on the fields as well, so I have to take time off from the office, which is difficult for me. And so, I mean, that is maybe more extreme type of change, right? But I think just to contrast that with, yeah, okay, I go to the co-op and I do all my shopping, and I don't think about where the food comes from, and I don't worry about what happens with the waste. So those are kind of the extremes, I would say. I think there's also quite a lot that shops can do. So another example is a little neighborhood shop where I live. Again, it's a group of people that came together and they said, okay, we're going to open up our own co-op, basically. And so they decide what products they buy and so on. Again, that's probably not something that's going to work mainstream, at least in the near future. But those are kind of interesting trends. Then the whole food area. And again, I'm not a financial expert, right? That you guys are that. So it may sound stupid what I'm saying, but what I hear from people working in the financial industry, the whole food area is sort of the El Dorado right now. It's what pharma used to be maybe 10 years, 15 years ago. So there's a lot of funds now investing into food startups with, you know, your whole range of non-animal protein products to, you know, sustainable chocolate, local production, fair trade, and so on. That seems to be a huge trend. And there's an appetite for that, increasingly so. I think it's probably also driven by the big food brands, if I can hazard that guess, because I think they're too big to change, frankly speaking. So they're probably also interested in seeing what's working on the market, what isn't working, and then what works, they kind of buy up. And I think that's why these food funds are so attractive, because again, I think people are hoping to cash in on that. I don't know if that answers your question though.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't call you stupid any day, maybe idealistic at some point, but I think yeah, good. And that's good. But I think it raises an interesting point. So, I mean, I think we talked about who are the gatekeepers earlier, right? And I think also the point you raised with the food investment funds, and actually my bank, they have a food venture capital fund now, but they're not doing that. So neither the gatekeepers nor the investors are doing this because they want to change the world per se, right? Because they're doing it because they see change consumer behavior, right? And you with your own personal behavior might be at the forefront of that, but obviously there's a long tail of shifts behind driving some of the changes that we need to see. But I have a different question. Because you talk to the regulators a lot. Can you talk a little bit? I mean, and that's the other driver of change, right? So what are sort of the topics that are sort of on regulators' minds right now? Sort of what is sort of the direction of travel coming out of Bern, Brussels, wherever? Glasgow?
Well, I mean, Bern is always a little bit behind what's happening elsewhere in the world. In Bern, people are talking about, you know, recycling packaging. That's kind of the big topic right now. And as I've said before, I think that's a dead end. Brussels has done something really, really interesting. So they've been working on the single-use plastics for a couple of years now. You've probably been following that. So there's quite a bit of changes coming through there. Hopefully Switzerland will decide to adopt those regulations as well sooner than later, but we'll see. Circular economy is a big sort of strategic development for the current commission, and there's two sub strategies to that which I want to highlight. One is farm to fork, and the other one is the chemical strategy for sustainability, and they both are relevant for food packaging. So the farm to fork strategy, basically, that was also published earlier last year, set out a kind of clear direction that it stated the Commission will revise its food contact regulations, and so that's ongoing right now. And now you've got a flavor of the complexity of the topic, so you can imagine it's really complicated to revise the regulation on food packaging, especially if you only have 3 people in the whole Commission who are responsible for it. Not joking. So I don't know how fast that's going to happen, but they say by mid-2023 they want to have a proposal. The other one, the other kind of overarching strategy is the chemical strategy for sustainability, and that was published exactly a year ago. And that has the potential to really stir things up big time. Why? Because the Commission made it very clear and this is from a political ambition, right? So this is on a political level. It wants to really crack down hard on the chemical industry. And the chemical industry, of course, is who makes food packaging. So this makes things quite a lot more complicated, but potentially the outcome could be that we really have a chance getting rid of hazardous chemicals in food packaging, but also in many, many other applications. And I think those are really interesting trends right now. Just to kind of end my comment quickly, why is it important to get rid of hazardous chemicals? Well, especially in a circular economy, if you think about you reusing or recycling materials, you don't always have control over how those materials get used, right? And people get creative. So, think about, I don't know, old car tires, and someone has the creative idea, oh, let's serve sushi on those. And they're full of toxic chemicals, but people don't think about the chemicals, right? They just think about, hey, I'm reusing this, what would normally be wasted. And so the trick there is get rid of the hazardous chemicals as much as possible so that people can be creative with how they use materials, even if you don't know exactly what they're doing.
Thanks a lot. That's really interesting. And maybe I maybe haven't looked at it, but I want to throw in, because it is a key topic within the financial industry, is the EU taxonomy, right? Which is a, I don't know, 900-page document or something like that, which defines what are sustainable activities from an EU perspective, and they're starting to sort of force financial market participants to shift capital towards these types of activities. And there's a part which is solely on circular economy. So there's this whole thing which defines what are sustainable activities in a circular economy. That was just published just a few months ago.
I have to have a look at that. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah. And so this is sort of the starting point, and now they're pushing everybody to, well, they do it by disclosure. Now we have to disclose how much of our investments are within these sustainable activities and which are not, and obviously then thereby moving everybody over to more, to finance more sustainable activities. Yeah. Okay, so it seems there's a lot going on the regulatory side, trying to push us into more sustainable future, I guess.
It's let me just say this. I know you don't want to talk about degrowth. We don't have to, but of course,
we can, but it's just maybe not the right forum to do that. That's all I'm saying. I'd be happy to have that.
Yeah, I mean, either you do it in a controlled way, which we're trying to do right now, or it's chaos, right? So anyway.
Yeah. I don't mind chaos. Creative spirit.
Yeah.
But anyway, I mean, we'll have that discussion over a beer.
Okay. Good. I'll take you up on it.
We'll get Heiko along, and then it gets really interesting. But anyways, the last question is really around NGOs. right? And sort of the topics. You said you're not an advocating type of organization, but what are sort of the key topics within the NGO space, which at many times are kind of the leading topics, which are leading sort of general, also societal discussions if you're 2 years down the road? What do you see there?
Well, I mean, like industry, NGOs also aren't a homogeneous bunch, right? And you've got sort of all shades of green there. I think the chemical strategy for sustainability is really keeping NGOs very, very, very busy right now. So yeah, I mean, there's a couple of key topics defined in there, and that's what NGOs are focusing a lot on right now. We're still fighting over endocrine disruptors. So these are chemicals that are present in plastic, but also in other materials and other products and food packaging, which can interfere with the hormone system, disrupt the hormone system, and lead to all kinds of effects, because the hormone system controls so many functions of the body. I think that's an evergreen. We'll see if we have any big changes there in the regulation. Children, health of children, future generations, protecting them. I think that's a huge topic. I mean, plastic continues to be a big topic, plastic in the whole life cycle. So, also this aspect of production, environmental justice, global south, protection of the global south. I think, these are all big topics. I don't know if that answers your question, really. It's kind of very, very broad.
No, good enough. And maybe as a last question, as we're starting to run out of time, because I mean, we've had a very free-ranging discussion about just general topics and trends in the industry. Maybe to end up on something slightly more concrete for the students, but what do you think is the role of the beverage carton in the future?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons why one shouldn't like beverage cartons. It's a multi-material, so it's a nightmare for recycling. It contains plastic on the inside, and the plastic interacts with the food, leaches untested chemicals, leaches hazardous chemicals. I don't know. I mean, I was on a panel about a year ago with someone from Tetra Pak, and they were saying, they're working on making a beverage carton that is completely bio-based. So I guess no aluminum used, renewable carbon used to make the plastic as well. And they were, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but I think they were also talking about making it biodegradable. And so, I mean, and having a food packaging that is biodegradable always is a slight of a contradiction, I have to say, because you want food packaging to preserve your food. And so you don't want something to spontaneously degrade, right? So I think, if they can come up with a product that contains no hazardous chemicals, that contains no untested chemicals, that is made from completely renewable carbon, sustainably sourced, minimizing the environmental impacts, and that can be somehow collected and then industrially composted, I think that could be an interesting product. Yeah.
Brilliant. The gauntlet is thrown down to the industry, shape up or die, I guess.
Well, we all have to shape up or die. I'm sorry, we all have to. So.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and since you called me old before, I'll die much faster than you. Well, you said the young people 30 to 40.
Okay, well, I am 46, so I'm also not part of young people anymore.
That's all right. No. Okay, thanks a lot, Jane. That was really interesting, brilliant discussion. And we'll follow up on the degrowth discussion separately here. So thanks everybody for joining. The hour is up. Thanks a lot to Jane. Thanks a lot to Mirjana for organizing this. And I hope everybody's working really hard on their presentations, which are coming up. Thanks a lot, guys. Have a nice weekend. Bye.
Yeah, thanks, Phil.